I still remember the first day I realized that something between me and my history teacher, Mr. Donovan, had changed. It was the beginning of junior year at Crestwood High, and I had always liked Mr. Donovan's class. He was one of those teachers who could make even the driest topics like the Cold War feel like a thriller. I wasn't the kind of student who usually got noticed, and honestly, I liked it that way. I kept my head down, got decent grades, and avoided drama. But something about the way he looked at me after a certain day started to make me uneasy. Before I get to that, I need to explain my relationship with my mom, Janet. She's complicated. She's smart, charismatic, and can charm anyone with that effortless smile she wears like armor. But there's also this aura of control about her, like she's always calculating how people perceive her and, by extension, me. Most of the time, I try to stay under her radar, but she likes to check in on my life in subtle ways, like casually meeting my teachers and getting their opinions on me. It was one of those check-in days when everything shifted. My mom had called me from work, saying she wanted to drop by the school for a quick visit. I had no choice but to agree. I had been dreading it, because the teachers usually fawn over her, and I hate that attention. But I shrugged it off. After all, my mom is charming, so this would be harmless, right? The moment she walked into Mr. Donovan's classroom, the atmosphere subtly shifted. She had that familiar smile plastered on, the kind that makes people relax and trust her instantly. I had noticed before how people, complete strangers, would change their tone around her. My teacher, who was normally so casual with students, suddenly became unusually polite, almost deferential. He stood up straight, shook her hand formally, and introduced her to some of the students as if she were a visiting dignitary rather than my mom. I sat there, feeling my cheeks burn, trying to be invisible, and hoping the visit would be brief. But it wasn't brief. Mom lingered, asking questions about my participation in class, my grades, and even Mr. Donovan's opinions about my potential. I wanted to crawl under the desk. And yet, the most uncomfortable moment was when my teacher, normally straightforward, started saying things like, "I think your daughter is exceptionally talented, and it's rare to have a student with such insight for her age." He said it with such an intensity that it almost felt rehearsed. I couldn't tell if he was genuinely impressed or just trying to stay in Mom's good graces. After she left, I thought things would go back to normal. But the very next class, I started noticing subtle differences. He would call on me first, often lingering on my answers longer than usual, nodding approvingly, sometimes even smiling in ways that felt odd. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe he just liked my participation. But then, it escalated. He began asking personal questions, ones that seemed unnecessary for the class. "How are things at home? Is your mom still encouraging you to apply for the honors program? Are you managing your workload okay?" He asked them casually, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't malicious, but it was heavy, like he was studying me, trying to understand something beneath the surface. And then there were the small privileges. He'd let me turn in assignments a little late without penalty, occasionally give me extra credit, and sometimes call me aside to discuss my work privately. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, or maybe he really was impressed. But after a few weeks, I started noticing patterns. Other students weren't getting the same treatment. And when someone questioned it, like Jenna, who usually sat behind me, Mr. Donovan would make excuses about my unique abilities or special circumstances. I didn't like feeling singled out. I never wanted special treatment, especially not from someone who was supposed to be fair to everyone. And the more I tried to act normal, the more I realized how different everything had become. Even small things, like the way he looked at me across the room or the subtle tone in his voice, felt loaded. One afternoon, he asked me to stay after class to discuss a project idea. Normally, staying late wasn't a big deal, but that day, I felt a tight knot in my stomach. I wasn't sure if it was excitement, anxiety, or something else entirely. When everyone left, he closed the door behind me and leaned against his desk, looking at me with a thoughtful expression. "You know, your mom mentioned that you're very perceptive for your age," he said casually, but there was an undercurrent in his voice I couldn't ignore. "I've noticed it too." I nodded, unsure how to respond. I wanted to say, "Thanks, I guess," but the words caught in my throat. Then he added, "It's rare to find students who can see patterns in history the way you do. Most of your peers are just memorizing dates, but you notice the connections." His praise should have made me feel proud, but instead, it made me uneasy. It felt like there was something behind his words, something he wasn't saying out loud. Over the next few weeks, the attention escalated in ways I couldn't explain. He started giving me feedback that felt almost personal. Not just about schoolwork, but about how I carried myself, how I spoke, even how I expressed opinions in class discussions. He was analyzing me, breaking me down in ways I couldn't understand. I found myself second-guessing my own behavior, wondering if I said too much, laughed too loudly, or answered questions in a way that drew his focus. It became exhausting. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when the shift happened, but it was there, a constant presence in the room whenever he spoke to me or looked my way. And I started noticing other students whispering, glancing between us, maybe sensing the unusual dynamic. One day, Jenna finally asked me directly after class, "Do you think he likes you, like, more than a student?" I froze. I didn't want to admit that the thought had crossed my mind, that I was confused and nervous about it. I don't know, I muttered, trying to sound nonchalant. But inside, a storm was brewing. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the way my mom's visit had set everything in motion. I replayed every interaction, every glance, every word he had said since, and I couldn't tell if this was just admiration, favoritism, or something else entirely. Something about it felt off, like a shadow stretched between us that wasn't there before. And then the small, almost invisible things started happening. He'd compliment me in front of others in ways that made them glance uncomfortably, or call me by my full name with a weight I didn't understand. He'd ask questions about my family, my life outside school, in ways that felt invasive. Not rude, not threatening, but heavy, like he was quietly testing boundaries. I started dreading class, even though I loved history, because the attention wasn't innocent, it carried a weight, a subtle pressure I didn't know how to shake. And no matter how careful I was, no matter how normal I acted, I couldn't escape it. Something had changed that day my mom walked in, and I knew instinctively that it wasn't going to go back to the way it had been. I just didn't know how far it would go or what it meant for me. By the end of that week, I realized I had two choices: pretend it wasn't happening and hope it passed, or confront the unsettling feeling head-on and risk making everything worse. But deep down, I knew that neither option would be simple. Something had been set in motion, something I couldn't see yet, and I had no idea how tangled my world would become because of it. The following week, the attention only intensified. I noticed it first during a group project in class. Mr. Donovan paired me with Lucas and Mia, two of my friends, but almost immediately he began hovering nearby, asking me questions I didn't need help with, offering suggestions that felt unnecessary, and watching my reactions like he was studying an experiment rather than teaching history. I kept glancing at my mom's words from her visit in my head, and I hated that I couldn't stop thinking about the subtle connection between her presence and the way he treated me. Then came the parent-teacher conference, which my mom had insisted on attending. I tried to protest, but she insisted, saying she wanted to stay involved and make sure I had every opportunity. I was dreading it, but what happened in that small conference room was worse than anything I could have imagined. Mr. Donovan greeted her with that same polished charm, the kind that seemed effortless, but this time there was a flicker of something in his eyes, like recognition, or maybe calculation. My mom complimented him on how engaging he was as a teacher and casually mentioned my achievements, making it sound like I was already a prodigy in history. Mr. Donovan nodded, smiled, and leaned in slightly as if memorizing every detail, and when he spoke, it was with a softness I had never heard in him before. "Your daughter shows remarkable insight," he said, and I felt my stomach twist. "I've noticed patterns in her thinking that most students wouldn't even attempt. She's exceptional." The way he said it made it sound like he was sharing a secret with my mom, and I realized I wasn't part of that conversation at all. I sat there, trying to appear calm, but I felt like an outsider in my own conference. When we left, my mom gave me that satisfied smile she always does, the one that says she's achieved exactly what she wanted. I tried to shrug it off, but the seed of unease had been planted. After that, every class with Mr. Donovan became a careful balance of pretending to be ordinary while he scrutinized me in ways that felt deliberate. He would comment on the way I wrote essays, not just for content, but for style, tone, and insight. He asked questions about my opinions on current events, and sometimes even challenged me in a way that made other students uncomfortable. I started noticing how he lingered at my desk longer than necessary, offering guidance that felt personal, almost invasive. I couldn't tell if it was mentorship or something else entirely. One afternoon, I stayed late to ask about a research assignment, and he suddenly shifted the conversation. "You know, your mom mentioned you're very intuitive, that you notice things others overlook," he said, leaning against the counter, his gaze fixed on me. "I think she's right. I've been paying attention, and there's a potential in you that isn't common." I tried to laugh it off, saying, "Thanks, I guess," but the weight of his words lingered. He studied me silently, and I felt exposed in a way I couldn't explain. Over the next days, I realized I was becoming hyper-aware of my every action around him. I tried to talk to my friends about it, but they mostly laughed it off, saying teachers sometimes favor students. But this was different. It wasn't just favoritism, it was personal, focused, and, at times, unnerving. One morning, I arrived early to finish homework, and he was already there, waiting. "I thought I might see you before class," he said casually, but the calm tone did nothing to hide the intensity in his eyes. He asked about my life outside school, about family dinners, weekend plans, even my ambitions for college. I tried to answer lightly, but he probed further, asking questions I couldn't understand the relevance of. The line between teacher and student felt blurred in ways that made me uneasy. By the time class started, I was distracted, anxious, and unsure of how to behave normally. That day, I noticed other students staring more than usual, whispering, maybe sensing something shifting that I couldn't control. I began to dread being noticed, yet I also couldn't ignore the attention. It was exhausting. And then came the email. I received a message from Mr. Donovan, marked urgent. My heart raced as I opened it. It wasn't about homework or grades. It was an invitation to meet after school to discuss ideas and guidance for your future projects, but the phrasing felt deliberate, almost loaded. I couldn't tell if it was mentorship or manipulation, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. That afternoon, I sat in the classroom long after everyone had left, my mind spinning. He walked in, closed the door softly behind him, and leaned on the desk. "I'd been thinking about our conversation last week," he began, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Your mom is insightful. She sees something in you that many overlook. I want to help you realize that potential." I nodded, unsure how to respond, feeling both flattered and trapped. The weight of his gaze made me nervous, and I realized that this was no longer just about school or history. Something deeper, more complicated, was unfolding, and I had no idea how far it would go or what it meant for me. Something had changed after that day my mom walked into the classroom, and I couldn't imagine going back to how things had been before. I felt a mixture of curiosity, fear, and confusion, like standing at the edge of a cliff, not knowing if the fall would hurt or if it would change everything. And in the back of my mind, a thought gnawed at me. My mom had always been able to influence people, but what if this time, she had set in motion something I couldn't control, something that would change my life in ways I wasn't ready for? The tension continued to build in ways I couldn't ignore. After that meeting, I began noticing how carefully Mr. Donovan timed his interactions with me. He would find excuses to call me aside, asking for input on assignments that had nothing to do with the class, or commenting on details no one else would notice. It was flattering in a strange way, but also suffocating. I started spending hours dissecting his words, trying to figure out what was normal teacher interest and what was something else. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation in the teacher's lounge that made my stomach drop. Mr. Donovan was talking to Ms. Harper, the English teacher, and though they didn't notice me standing near the door, I caught snippets of what they said. "She's like her mother," he murmured, almost under his breath. "Sharp, observant, but there's more there than anyone realizes. It's like I'm seeing the patterns before she does." Ms. Harper laughed lightly, but the comment made my heart pound. Patterns? Seeing things before I do? It was as if he was studying me, analyzing me, and perhaps even planning something. I shook my head and walked away, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood. But later that week, things escalated in ways that made me realize I couldn't ignore it any longer. During class, he asked me to stay after again, this time alone, and he had a folder in his hands. "I've been reviewing your work from last semester," he said, flipping through pages. "There's a lot here that shows potential beyond the classroom. I think you could handle more advanced projects, maybe even independent research." His tone was casual, but the intensity in his gaze made it impossible to relax. I nodded, unsure how to respond, feeling a mix of pride and unease. Then he paused, leaned slightly closer, and said, "Your mother is remarkable, you know. She always knows how to guide you, how to make others see your abilities. I can see why she takes such pride in you." I felt a shiver run down my spine. He wasn't just complimenting me, he was connecting me to my mom in a way that felt personal, almost invasive. Over the next few days, I tried to act normally, but everything in class felt like a spotlight on me. He would call on me for answers that weren't necessary, linger near my desk, and even correct minor mistakes in front of others in a way that drew attention. I began noticing whispers from my classmates, glances that I couldn't ignore. It was like everyone sensed something shifting, but no one knew exactly what. Then came the turning point. My mom called me one evening and casually mentioned that she had talked to Mr. Donovan about my college applications. I froze. I hadn't given her permission to share details, and suddenly it clicked. She had orchestrated this, subtly influencing him, making him invest in me more than any normal teacher would. The thought made me furious, not at Mr. Donovan, but at my mom for involving me in something I didn't ask for. I confronted her gently, asking why she had spoken to him without telling me. She smiled, that infuriating calm smile of hers, and said, "I just want to make sure you have every opportunity, sweetheart. He sees your potential. I wanted him to support you." I tried to reason with her, explaining that the attention from Mr. Donovan was making me uncomfortable, but she brushed it off, insisting that teachers who recognized talent were a blessing. I hung up the phone feeling trapped. The next day at school, everything felt heavier. Mr. Donovan greeted me with that same intensity, asking if I had talked to my mother about our discussion. I wanted to scream that it was none of his business, but I forced a small nod and said yes. He smiled, and it wasn't friendly, it was knowing, like he had secrets and I was just beginning to glimpse them. The projects, the feedback, the personal questions, all of it intensified. He began suggesting extra reading, optional assignments, and independent study projects that no one else received. Sometimes he would comment on my demeanor, my confidence, even my expressions during discussions. I felt like I was constantly under a microscope, and no matter how careful I was, I couldn't escape it. By the end of the week, I realized that the lines between mentorship, favoritism, and something more personal were blurring. I couldn't tell where guidance ended and obsession began. And worst of all, I began noticing subtle changes in myself. I started doubting my own instincts, wondering if my thoughts and feelings were genuine or being influenced by the way he treated me. I felt like I was losing control over how I was perceived, and that frightened me more than anything else. Then, one afternoon, I overheard him talking to a student in the hallway about patterns and potential, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't just about me excelling in history. It was about him seeing me as something more than a student, as someone shaped by my mother's influence but also shaped for his own perception. I felt cornered, powerless, and anxious, knowing that my life, my choices, and even my sense of self were being quietly scrutinized and manipulated. Something had been set in motion, and I couldn't escape the realization that my mother's charm had opened a door I never wanted opened. The day it all started to unravel began innocuously enough. I arrived early to class, as I often did, to finish homework and avoid the lingering eyes of my classmates. Mr. Donovan was already there, leaning against his desk with that familiar, almost predatory look that had become impossible to ignore. "I'm glad you're early," he said casually, but the weight behind his words made me tense. He motioned for me to come closer, and I obeyed instinctively, my stomach tightening. "I wanted to discuss something important," he said, opening a folder filled with papers, notes, and what looked like essays I had never written. My heart skipped a beat. I had no idea what he was talking about, but the intensity of his gaze told me it was serious. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "Your mother has told me about your ambitions, and I want to help guide you. But I need to know that you're ready to put in the work." I nodded, but the phrasing felt like a test, and I realized that he wasn't just offering guidance, he was assessing my willingness to submit to his attention and influence. Over the next few minutes, he outlined projects, research ideas, and study plans that went far beyond the scope of a high school curriculum. I felt trapped in a mixture of fascination and fear. Part of me wanted to excel, to prove that I could handle this, but another part of me recoiled at the creeping sense that I was being manipulated, shaped, and watched in ways I couldn't escape. After class, I rushed home, desperate to talk to someone, anyone. I tried calling my friends, but the words stuck in my throat. None of them had ever experienced anything like this, and I knew they wouldn't understand the tension, the unspoken control that seemed to wrap around me whenever Mr. Donovan was near. That night, I confronted my mom gently, asking why she had involved him so deeply in my academic life without my consent. She smiled that irritating, self-assured smile, telling me that she was only trying to help, that recognizing talent and providing guidance was a gift, not a trap. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew that she had unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, set a dangerous chain of events in motion. Over the following days, the dynamics in class grew more complicated. Mr. Donovan began giving me tasks in secret, private assignments that no one else received. He praised my observations in ways that seemed over the top, commenting not just on the work but on how I thought, how I analyzed, how I responded emotionally to the material. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and increasingly unsure of my own judgment. Then came the whispering. I started hearing murmurs in the hallway, seeing classmates glance at me with curiosity, suspicion, and sometimes jealousy. Someone asked if I was dating him. I laughed it off nervously, but the words lingered, and suddenly, I realized that the situation was more visible than I had thought. The attention I had tried to ignore was now impossible to escape. One afternoon, I decided to confront Mr. Donovan directly. After class, I stayed behind and asked, "Why are you doing this? Why are you focusing on me like this?" He paused, studying me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "I see potential," he said simply, but the tone in his voice suggested it was more than that. "Your mother sees it too, and I'm merely supporting what she has recognized. You're special. Rare." I felt a shiver run through me. The words sounded complimentary, but they carried a weight I couldn't shake. That night, I stayed awake, going over every interaction, every comment, every lingering glance. I realized that I couldn't ignore it any longer. The teacher-student dynamic had shifted into something far more complicated, and the involvement of my mom had added a layer I couldn't untangle. Then, as if to confirm my fears, I noticed something odd the next day. Mr. Donovan had left a note on my desk, written in neat, deliberate handwriting, "Meet me in the library after school. There's something I want to show you. Alone." My hand shook as I read it. Alone. I had never been asked to meet him alone outside the classroom, and my mind raced with possibilities. Was it mentorship, obsession, or something else entirely? I debated whether to go. The rational part of me screamed to avoid it, but the other part, the part that had been manipulated into seeking his attention, made me curious. I decided to go, telling myself it would be quick, harmless, just to see what he wanted. When I arrived, the library was empty, quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. He was waiting at a secluded table, his eyes locking onto mine as I approached. I wanted to show you something, he said, spreading out papers and photos across the table. My heart raced. Among the sheets were examples of my work, yes, but also notes about me that I had never shared, observations about how I reacted to questions, the way I walked in the hallway, even how I spoke to classmates. I froze. How did you get these? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me calmly. Your mother mentioned things in passing, he said. I'm just connecting the dots. It's to help you. But it didn't feel like help. It felt like surveillance, control, a slow erasure of my privacy. I realized, with a sinking sense of dread, that what had started as admiration and guidance had crossed a line I couldn't ignore. My mother's involvement had opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through, and now I was standing in the middle of a situation I couldn't easily escape. Something had shifted, and I was trapped in a delicate balance between fascination, fear, and a growing sense that I needed to reclaim control before it was too late. I couldn't sleep that night after the library incident. Every detail of the papers, the observations, the way he looked at me, replayed in my mind. I kept thinking about my mom, about how her involvement had triggered this entire chain of events, and a wave of anger and confusion washed over me. I realized I had to confront both of them, not in a naive way, but to set boundaries before things spiraled out of control. The next morning, I walked into class with a resolve I hadn't felt before. Mr. Donovan greeted me with that same intensity, and I had to fight the urge to shrink under his gaze. Instead, I squared my shoulders, determined not to let fear control me. During a break, I approached him. We need to talk, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable, and nodded. After class, he asked. I nodded. When everyone had left, we stood in the empty classroom. I need to be honest, I said, my hands trembling slightly. I feel like the attention and the assignments, the personal observations, it's too much. I need space. I need boundaries. I can't continue if things stay like this. He studied me silently, and for a moment I thought he might dismiss me or try to pressure me into continuing, but instead, he leaned back, his expression softening. I understand, he said. I may have crossed lines I didn't intend to. Your mother's influence and my own enthusiasm may have combined in ways that were inappropriate. I apologize. You have every right to ask for space. Relief washed over me, but there was still a knot in my stomach. I knew the dynamic wouldn't disappear overnight, and I resolved to maintain my distance while continuing to excel in class. Later that evening, I called my mom. I explained calmly how uncomfortable I had felt, how her casual involvement had unintentionally escalated the situation, and that I needed her to step back. There was a pause on the other end, then her voice softened. I didn't realize it had made you feel this way, she admitted. I just wanted to help. I'll back off. For the first time, I felt like I was being heard without manipulation, without charm, without hidden agendas. Over the next few weeks, things gradually normalized. Mr. Donovan continued to teach, still professional, still engaging, but the intensity between us dissipated. He respected the boundaries I had set, and I began to regain a sense of control over my own life. The lingering anxiety faded, replaced by a cautious confidence. I realized that while my mom's influence could open doors, it could also create situations I wasn't prepared for. I had learned to assert myself, to speak up, and to recognize when attention, no matter how flattering, wasn't appropriate. And perhaps most importantly, I understood that my own voice mattered, that I could set limits even with people in positions of authority. Looking back, I can see how precarious the situation had become. I could have let the discomfort fester, allowed fear and confusion to dominate, but instead I confronted it head-on. I learned about boundaries, self-respect, and the importance of speaking up. My relationship with both my mom and Mr. Donovan shifted, healthier, more aware, and balanced. That experience taught me to trust my instincts, to recognize the subtle ways influence can shape situations, and to assert myself before being swept along by someone else's perception or desire. In the end, it wasn't about being special or exceptional. It was about understanding that my life, my choices, and my sense of self were mine to protect, even when others, no matter how well-meaning or authoritative, tried to sway me. And as I walked into class the next day, greeted by familiar faces and a professional, courteous teacher, I felt a weight lift. I had faced the tension, confronted the influence, and reclaimed my space. The lesson wasn't in history, essays, or accolades, it was in recognizing my own voice, asserting my boundaries, and understanding that respect, both given and received, was the true measure of any relationship, academic or otherwise. And for the first time in weeks, I could focus on learning, growing, and being myself without fear, without scrutiny, and without the shadow of someone else's expectations pressing down on me. The teacher who had treated me differently after meeting my mom had become just that, a teacher. And I had become exactly who I was meant to be, confident, self-aware, and capable of navigating even the most complicated dynamics with clarity and strength.